So as we get started, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Cameron Klein, an executive consultant here at WSA. Cameron's an expert in guiding organizations through complex workforce challenges, especially in the hospitality industry. With hands-on experience working with over 50 companies and spending countless nights in casino resorts and on cruise ships, Cameron has gained an in-depth understanding of all aspects of operations. His unique perspective and extensive knowledge in the industry's challenges and opportunities make him an invaluable resource. So please welcome me in joining Dr. Cameron Klein. And I'll kick it over to you, Cameron.
Thank you, Sheena, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. So we've got a tight schedule here, so I'm going to move fairly quickly, but I certainly do welcome any questions that you have for the Q&A channel here as we go through. We'll have some time here at the end to address those questions. So in the last 20 years or so, since I've been in this space, the experience space, and primarily focused on engagement and life cycle surveys, I've across 3 different companies I've worked for, I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of different companies in the hospitality space. And you can see many of these companies on here. Some of these are in a former life. Not all of these are WSA customers. But in my experience, I've had a close hand look at a lot of these companies. And it's been really fortunate because it's just a lot of fun to work in the hospitality space. There's something about the mission that people are doing. People are, they're in the business of providing great experiences and having generating fun times, memorable lifetime memories for families, for individuals who are at a resort or on a cruise ship, or even having a great meal at a restaurant. So working with these groups has been really a true pleasure. And in that capacity, I've been able to travel the world, travel all the US and North America, and see front of house operations, back of house operations on cruise ships and casino resorts. So lots of experience, a lot of things that are sort of in common across that. But then also what I've learned is that each group has their own culture a little bit to some extent. So the thing they have in common is that they're there providing great experiences. The things that are unique are around kind of the history of the company, the legacy, the founders, and also the specific niche that they're in terms of the industry. So I'll bring some of this to bear when we get into some of the data here, and we'll go ahead and jump right into it. So when we think about the areas we're going to focus on over here for the next 25 minutes or so, really into 3 buckets. So understanding external forces. So thinking about how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the hospitality industry more so than really any other industry that we've seen. We'll also talk about the unionization trends we've seen pick up really in the last couple of years. And then also talk about the global war for talent. So as this industry is rapidly expanding, what does that mean for retaining top talent and creating a great experience that people want to stay with the organization longer? The second part, we'll dive into some specific data from our benchmark database and have a couple insights to share there. And then we'll close with a couple of case studies and a discussion of business metrics across the hospitality industry. If you want to go in further and link your engagement or experience data to some of your business metrics, we'll talk a little bit about how a couple of organizations have done that, and also how you may take that journey yourself going forward. So let's start. We'll start with kind of the external impacts before we get into some data here. And again, we're going to look at the COVID-19 lasting impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic, unionization trends, and the war for talent, as I mentioned. So COVID-19 pandemic, right? Probably if you're like me, you're just about tired of hearing about it at this point. I know personally it changed my life in many ways. I used to be a frequent traveler for this job, actually, and travel 3 or 4 times a month, and that got shut down. So in March of 2020, the world sort of shut down. Trips began to be canceled. Shortly after that, the cruise line industry shut down completely. And to be honest, a lot of people were let go too. So cruise lines shut down entirely. Hotels and restaurants shut down temporarily or reduced capacity. And a lot of the corporate team members that I've worked with over the years had to be let go. There was just huge cost pressures, and so a lot of these groups are sort of rebuilding their programs around experience and engagement. In some cases, picking up right where they left off. In other cases, having to sort of go back a little bit, one step further back to really build a great foundation for their program. So from a programmatic standpoint and from just an employee standpoint, the pandemic was huge. And I know leaders and organizations immediately had to become experts in PPE and figure out how to protect their team members and employees coming back to work. Team members felt that. I think in many cases we saw scores go up. On one of our previous webinars, we've talked about the long-term trends on engagement. We did see a nice increase or a spike around March 2020 for the rest of 2020, and this industry was no different. And if you still had a job, you were thankful to have a job, and you were also thankful that your leadership was taking the pandemic seriously and trying to do what they could to protect you in what truly was a once in a lifetime, or at least once in 100 years type of a global health crisis that we all faced. So initially, lots of anxiety around their own physical safety, and again, lots of fluctuations in the business operations themselves. And that's weighed on team member confidence in terms of the future of the company and the future of them, the future that they have within those organizations. Hospitality industry, I would argue, was hit harder than any other industry by the pandemic. And even within the hospitality industry, I would argue that the cruise line industry was hit the hardest. And as I was looking up data on this, I know we experienced it directly because we were working with a cruise line company directly at the time and getting ready to admin their survey. The world shut down around March 2020. And for the most part, cruises did not open back up for over a year. And so that's 1 year of operating a very expensive business without guests. That's going to have a big impact on the business going forward. So that's sort of that's the negative side. Certainly, there's a positive angle to this in terms of the comeback and everybody coming back to vacationing. Unprecedented demand right now in terms of cruises, and also hotel resorts have also bounced back quite strongly. So, but that is one of the forces that we've seen here. Unionization trends is another one. So, lots of headlines about this in the last couple of years, especially in Las Vegas, but also Reno, all over California, really all over the country. We've seen increased union activity for hospitality workers. And a lot of times that has been focused on compensation and benefits. So as we all know, after the pandemic hit and sort of the next few years, supply chain disruptions, other issues have caused major increases in prices, like a lot of us haven't seen, at least in quite a while. And so with increased prices, people's earning power was less, right? So unions recently have been focused on compensation as a way to get back some of that earning power for their union members, essentially here. And when it comes to hospitality, this is just a sample list of recent union activity, but Chipotle, Starbucks, and then lots of different casino resorts have also seen activity around the organizing attempts and new contracts and things like that. Some of the unions within hospitality that are quite common. So Unite here, the Culinary Workers, Hotel Trades Councils, the Service Employees International Union. There are others as well. There are local chapters of most or all of these. So, and really this was a kind of a worldwide thing, but in the US in particular, really widespread activity over the last couple of years. And so what does that mean for organizations that have to look at the bottom line when they're giving large pay increases to their team members? It might mean they have to pull back on other programs, learning and development or recognition or employee experience programs. So it just depends on the organization, but it's had an impact to some degree for all organizations. This chart I pulled from Bloomberg recently, and it shows that just basically demonstrates it. And you can see from 2015 to 2020, wage increases were, at about the 3% level, sort of keeping track with inflation, maybe a little bit ahead, but they weren't really increasing as you get into 21. Costs have certainly started going up by then, but wages were not. And so unions sort of stepped in and helped generate record pay raises in the year of 2023. And also this has continued in 24 as well. And so probably more activity that we can expect going forward. And my position, and I know WSA's position, is not that we are anti-union in any way. In fact, if you're not creating a good experience for your folks, I would encourage people to organize and collectively bargain for things around working conditions and things like that, fair treatment. If you're not experiencing those, there's a time and a place certainly for unions, but I know also it's more expensive when you have a fully unionized workforce, right? So from an organizational perspective, there is sometimes a desire to prevent further organizing activity, even if there is unions in place already, but to prevent further organization going forward. So one of the things we do with a lot of our customers, and this actually extends beyond hospitality into manufacturing and other sectors as well, but we can create a bespoke employee relations index. So looking at areas like like pay and fair treatment and safety and trust and leadership, things like that, that tend to predict whether a group of people will be susceptible to organizing attempts or not. And the research on that goes back 40 years at this point, 40 or 50 years at this point. So, we can work with the items you have in your current survey. We've done that with a number of customers, or we can identify groups that are profiling like they might become unionized in the future. And so that's always something that we can look at with you going forward. The last trend I'll talk about here before we move into some of the data is the global war for talent and the associated growth in the hospitality industry. So there are a lot of different estimates when it comes to the cost of turnover. A conservative estimate that I've located that takes into a number of things into account is about 36,000 per employee or per team member that you're replacing. That differs depending on the level. So higher level jobs, the cost of replacement is even higher. And when you're losing your top talent, your high performing individuals, the cost is also higher as well. So it is not cheap to have a high turnover rate and be able to have a profitable business, right? So what do you do in terms of making sure that you're building the best experience possible so that your folks want to stay there for the long term and that they're committed to working on behalf of the organization? In terms of the growth, just briefly touching on that. So just by way of example, for those of you who may not be in this space every single day or in these particular sectors, the cruise line industry, so since 1970, has 20 times as many ships as they had in 1970. So I don't know very many industries that were around in 1970 that are now 20 times larger than they were. Certainly, several technology companies are much bigger than they were if they even existed back then. But for most industries, 20 times growth in that period of time is just dramatic, right? So these are not companies generally that had a lot of these have not had 100-year experience in terms of managing people and building great experiences, things like that. It's been more of a recent phenomenon and really spiking even more since 2000. So about a 4 times increase in the number of passengers on cruise ships just in the last couple of decades. Casino resorts right now, a lot of headlines going on across the US. We'll start there. So lots of new casino resorts going up all over the place, including several in WSA's home state of Nebraska, but also a lot of activity in the New York area and really around the country where casino gambling is becoming legalized and a source of revenue for a lot of states who are looking for that revenue. In Europe, places like Spain are opening up casinos for the first time. In the Middle East, the UAE, among other places, is looking at building these mega resorts. And we're not talking about, a small, off the beaten path sort of resort. We're talking about mega resorts ran by some of the biggest brands that you would recognize in the space. And then also Asia, so places like Japan, South Korea are getting into the industry as well. So what does that mean? When you think about who staffs, and I guess primarily with cruise lines, but also relates to resorts, especially global resorts, a lot of the workers that you bring in to staff a company that large tend to come from some lower wage companies. There's overrepresentation in some cases on cruise ships from places like India, Indonesia, Philippines, things like that, places like that. And so to the extent that globally there are going to be more ships in the sea and more mega casino resorts, you are going to be competing for the same pools of talent, but against more companies and also competing against companies that are not in the same sector. So the war for talent is real. This is not my day-to-day space, but I know just in looking at some of the research and talking to some colleagues that it is a real challenge to fill all the open roles that you have, especially as the growth is really extraordinary right now. So reputation is key. I've said to a lot of my customers over the years, if you can find a way to be known as the best, for example, casino resort in Las Vegas, and if you can be known as the best place to work for, you are more likely to retain your top end employees. They're less likely to leave for a 25-cent raise or a 50-cent raise down the street somewhere else if you can build that reputation. It starts with measuring. It starts with understanding, what people are looking for when it comes to their experience, but it really continues with acting on that data. And so to the extent that you're acting on the data, you're building a great place to work, you can communicate that it's a great place to work through your employee value proposition, you will have a leg up over your competitors when it comes to retaining talent in an already thin market for talent in many places. So this is a huge trend that's impacted the hospitality industry. So we've talked about a few key trends here. Let's jump into some of the data from the WSA data, our proprietary normative database. You can see some of the statistics here. So it is a 3-year rolling average. Right now, it includes over 142 different countries, 116 million survey responses. One thing about our database that's important to note is that one, it's a 3-year rolling average, so we do kick out data that's old, and that was really important last December when we kicked out the 2020 data that saw that spike from the COVID spike, which really came back down starting in 2021. We'll be refreshing the database again in the November, December timeframe, and we'll be kicking out the 2021 data. So we're always kind of the most up to date as we can be when it comes to comparisons. We also only include census surveys, so we're not including pulse surveys. And if you're surveying, part of your population 4 times a year, we may just look for the census survey, or in some cases we may not be able to include it at all. So we are kind of selective about the projects that go into the database, but that allows us to get great data. And then for what I'll share with you here, we pulled out of those 1,615 projects we've ran over the last 3 years, the ones that were specific to hospitality, to pull out just a couple of insights with our brief time today here. And so what I've done is I've pulled up our kind of standard 4-item engagement index. We're measuring overall, are you satisfied to work for the company? Are you thinking about looking for a new job? Are you proud to work there? And would you recommend it to others as a great place to work? And looking at that overall, 73% is the overall benchmark across industries. Hospitality is also at 73%, but they get there a different way. So satisfaction is higher, pride is higher, but that intent to stay is lower at 57% over the last 3 years. Now, part of that, at least in the early part of that 3-year time frame, may have been a compensation issue. So before some of these big union wins, in the the 7+% average pay raise that folks have been getting, they may have felt underpaid, and they may have been more likely to leave to a competitor for a small, again, 25-50 cent raise in some cases. So but also it can be tough work, right? So building a great experience can get people through those tough times. And again, with the war for talent, you want to make sure that you are retaining your top folks, and trying to pull up that number from 57% is key. As you look at some of the other industries I put on here, these are on here primarily because they are the largest industries in terms of the volume of normative data that we work with. And you can see on the bottom row, actually, there's not a huge difference in engagement from one industry to the next. So overall average 73%. Finance and insurance is the highest scoring at 77%. Manufacturing a little lower at 71%. But you're talking about a +3 or +4 or -3, -4 at the most when it comes to industry comparisons. What we do see, and not shown here, is really large differences from one country or region to the next. So sometimes a 20 or 30 point difference from some countries to other countries. So to the extent you have a global team, that may be something you want to look into when it comes to looking at regional benchmarks that are more sort of apples to apples to your company here. And as I mentioned here, the intent to stay is lower. And so the highlights here are the items that are the areas, I should say, that are ±3% or more from that overall score. And you can see the hospitality score for the intent to stay item is 3 points lower. And that's when we're talking about the volume of responses we're looking at, that is a meaningful and statistically significant difference with a lower intent to stay in general for the hospitality industry. When it comes to key drivers of engagement, when we're partnering with our technology partners, we want to run a key driver analysis to see what are those items from the rest of the survey that are impacting that engagement index. And a lot of the common things are around, trust in leadership, or belief in the future of the company, belief in the future for myself. Do I have a career with the company? Which, by the way, is the #1 reason why people leave organizations, if they don't feel like they have a career there. Managers and supervisors tend to be lower on the list. When we look at key drivers of engagement, they are not usually in the top 5. But when we look at the hospitality industry, they are higher up on the list. So this chart is showing you the items with the biggest difference in the correlation to engagement between hospitality versus all other industries. So the correlation to these supervisor items, 0.59, 0.6, whereas other industries considerably lower, around 0.5, a little bit above that. And at 0.5, when you look at the key drivers in a dashboard, those aren't really hitting the radar. They're going to be further down the list, somewhere in ranked 15th or 20th. You're not really going to have the insight that, hey, we've got a low score on items around my immediate supervisor, and we know that they're important to engagement. For most organizations, they are lower down the list. For hospitality, they are higher on the list. And so I know a correlation difference of 8 points is maybe not maybe doesn't seem like a lot, but that could be the difference between ranking in the top 5 versus ranking outside the top 20 when it comes to key drivers of engagement. So one of the takeaways, and I've experienced this myself, and I think cruise lines are the best example of this. If you think about the team members on a cruise ship, everybody works on a different contract, and you have folks on the ship that are on the ship for 6 months straight or 9 months straight. They're on very long contracts. They generally don't get to go home, during that time period. They're away from their family. Going home at night just means going to their cabin. So the relationships they have with their fellow coworkers and with their supervisors are absolutely critical. I think this is true to some extent in hotels, resorts, and restaurants as well, but in particular on cruise ships, where that relationship is so critical, and also the relationship to senior leadership. So when I've been on cruise ships and I've done focus groups and I ask people sort of what their experience is like, if they've been on board for a couple of months or more, they might say something like, well, it's great now, but 6 weeks ago was terrible because we had a different hotel officer, or we had a different deck or technical officer. So the leadership on board, extending from top leadership down to frontline supervisors, is absolutely critical for their experience. It can be the difference between people wanting to stay with the organization long term and building a career, or more of a one and done, I'm going to do a contract and then I'm out and I probably won't renew. So a lot of companies in the space will do end of contract surveys, sort of like an exit survey in a way, to determine what people are thinking as they exit their contract and take maybe a month off or so before they come back. But this supervisor relationship is really critical for this space, more so than other industries. And that's something I definitely wanted to highlight and share today. In the third section, I wanted to talk a little bit about some broader business metrics across the industry, and then share a couple of case studies. And just with our time here, we won't have much more time than that. But if we think about engagement and what does it really mean? So engagement, we know, has a link to business performance, but how does it link to business performance? And so the way to think about it, I think, is that the engaged employee is more likely to care more about the work that they do. They're more likely to look out for their fellow team members, look out for the organization. Organizational citizenship behaviors is one of the technical psychological terms that's used. Discretionary effort is also another term that's used in psychology to talk about people willing to go above and beyond their job description on behalf of their organization. So when you can build a strong culture of engagement and experience in an organization, you earn that discretionary effort, you earn that loyalty, and you earn better customer or guest service from the folks who work for you. And so that's when it leads to higher business performance. And some sample business metrics that I've pulled up. If you're in a restaurant, this is not an exhaustive list, but there are a number of different metrics that a lot of restaurant operators would keep a very close track of. Same store sales, for example, number of complaints, and also on the employee side, employee turnover or voluntary turnover, regrettable voluntary turnover in particular. Fairly similar when it comes to hotels and resorts. Of course, a lot of these would have restaurants within them, so those metrics would carry right over. But some additional metrics around average length of stay, revenue per available room. These again are a lot of the metrics that hotel organizations would track very closely, and that can be linked to engagement or experience survey data. And then same thing with cruise lines as well. So they have their own set of metrics. A lot of these would overlap between the three. And again, meant to be an exhaustive list. There are certainly others that are on there. So what does this mean for doing a study? I think if you have, if you're an owner operator of a restaurant chain and you've got at least 30 locations, you've got a great data set to start looking at correlations and even maybe causal relationships potentially between increases and engagement. I'll say engagement broadly to refer to the whole survey. So that could be recognition, it could be learning and development, it could be different things. But let's just say increases in engagement leading to increases or improvements in business metrics. So more engaged locations have lower food cost, or have fewer complaints, or have higher customer satisfaction. And hotels and resorts are a little bit different. For large hotel chains, lots of data points. But if you're operating a single casino resort location, it may be, to be fair, a little bit more difficult to do these types of linkage studies, because you don't have enough data points unless you can get down to like the department level or the shift level. Certainly you can look at something like accidents or turnover, but a lot of these other metrics may be specific to the restaurants or the hotel side or the gaming side of casino resorts. So in some cases, there are a little bit more limitations if you have a fewer number of locations. Cruise lines, again, great opportunity. Some of the largest cruise line operators have dozens or even approaching up to 100 ships for one of them in particular. So You can compare ship by ship and look at ship engagement and experience and compare it to some of the key metrics that you look at. A lot of data to do a very strong study. And what this gives you is that you can show frontline managers and leaders that I know you're really focused on, average daily rate or repeat customers or guest experiences. And by engaging your teams, you can have an impact on those other metrics that you're already focused on. So for a lot of us on this call, I don't think I need to sell you on the importance of engagement or experience, but for some of the folks you'll be working with to show them that evidence can be pretty powerful to get more people on board with action planning on the survey. A couple of quick examples before we wrap up. So with one large restaurant operator with a sufficient number of locations, we looked at guest satisfaction. If you know anything about guest satisfaction scores, they often do not have a lot of variability. In this case, regardless of which engagement quartile the locations fell into, the scores are within a range of about 8.3 to 8.6. What's interesting about this is that the lowest quartile of engagement scores, the low, the high, but you really don't see the payoff until you get to the highest. So going from below average to average is not going to give you, in this case, at least, not going to give you a huge boost in guest satisfaction, but going from maybe above average to top quartile or best in class, that's when you get a larger bump when it comes to outcomes like guest satisfaction. So again, doesn't look like a huge difference when you do the math here, but when it comes to customer and guest numbers, a tenth of a point is actually pretty meaningful. Another one, we looked at guest satisfaction and revenue per available room. In this case, we had 120 locations for a hotel. We grouped these into high scoring engagement, medium, and low scoring. So this is how they were segmented. The high scoring had an average of 91% engagement, the medium 73%. Low scoring, the bottom 40 locations had an average of 53% engagement. Then you can see again, guest service, the guest service index that was calculated pretty similar to what we saw on the previous page. Doesn't look like a ton of variability, but a half a point is actually pretty meaningful. And then revenue per available room also showing is stronger for the most engaged locations. And so for the top 40 hotels, 30% higher engagement than the lowest scoring, 6% higher guest satisfaction scores, 11% higher revenue per available room, nearly 30% fewer reported guest problems, and then 5% higher guest loyalty. So how do you bring some of your lowest quartile locations into that top quartile and improve the experience, improve the guest service and commitment to quality and quality products and services so you can realize some of these gains when it comes on the back end? So again, if you have sufficient data, I would always recommend doing your own study, looking at your own data, because that does make the strongest case for your organization. Just to wrap up here, we also found these three specific items when we looked at year-over-year change. Looking at changes and scores on these three items were directly associated with guest satisfaction. So if you got better at providing resources to team members, to making sure that their talents and abilities were utilized and providing them with development, if you got better at that from one year to the next, you were also getting better at overall guest satisfaction. These three items across the entire survey had the strongest relationship to that outcome. So it may look different in different organizations in terms of what are the best items to work on. And again, that's why I recommend always that you would look at your own research and see what's important for your environment. So with that being said, a huge renaissance for the hospitality industry, really coming out of the low point of the pandemic, and demand is as high as it's ever been. And really, I hope I've reinforced the importance of measuring the right things, committing to action, and how that can impact the bottom line. And looking at it in your own organization is a key next step. So we're just right on time here. I just want to introduce the next session here that'll be September 18th. We're going to focus on a deep dive on financial services. And with that, I will pause. We've got some questions potentially.
Yeah, and most of these you've answered, Cameron, so I'll just pull out one for the sake of time that was kind of different than the rest. But what kind of seasonal impact should we consider in administering our program as part of this industry, knowing there's the high seasonal population?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it depends a little bit on the specific sort of sub-industry or which sector you're in. What I would advise is sort of know your business, know the very busiest times for your team members, when your team members, your managers are the most stressed, and don't survey during that time, right? So find a little bit of a slower period. For a lot of organizations, there are no slow periods, but if you do have some seasonal effects on your business, find a slower period so you can really focus a little bit more on the results, especially when the data becomes available in the dashboards and leaders have data to work with. So
perfect. Well, thank you so much, Cameron. Thank you all for joining our webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in September.
okay, thanks, Gina. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.